Have you ever wondered who you truly are? Or what it means to be yourself? The concept of anatta, often translated as no self, challenges our deepest beliefs about identity and existence. It can feel confusing or even frustrating, especially when we try to understand it through the lens of our everyday experience. But what if this teaching isn't about erasing who we are, but about discovering a deeper truth? What if the path to ultimate freedom and happiness lies not in holding on to who we think we are, but in letting go of that very idea? In today's video, we will explore the profound wisdom of anatta and how embracing this concept can lead to freedom from suffering and a life of true peace. Buddha's approach to questions. In Buddhism, the Buddha's approach to answering questions is methodical and precise. He categorized all questions into 4 types. Those that can be answered directly with a yes or no. Those that require analysis. Those that demand a counter-question to prompt deeper reflection. And finally, those questions that should be set aside because they do not lead to the end of suffering. The questions about the self fall into the last category. Why? Because asking whether a self exists, whether it's eternal or separate, does not directly help in alleviating suffering. These questions only serve to deepen the confusion and attachment that lead to more suffering. By categorizing questions in this way, the Buddha encourages us to focus on the practical aspects of our lives, the path to liberation. He didn't engage with abstract questions that detract from the purpose of the teachings, the cessation of suffering. The true goal of the Buddha's teachings was to help people transcend suffering, not to provide theoretical answers about the nature of self. The danger of misinterpreting the Buddha's teachings. One of the greatest dangers in understanding anatta, the teaching of no self, is that it can be misinterpreted. Many scholars, spiritual teachers, and even practitioners misapply the Buddha's method of addressing questions. They might either force an answer where there is none, or they may draw inferences from the Buddha's teachings that he did not intend. For example, some interpretations claim the Buddha rejected the idea of an eternal self or a separate self. But the Buddha didn't deny any of these in concrete terms. Instead, he pointed out that these questions are irrelevant to the task at hand, the liberation from suffering. The mistake lies in trying to fit an answer into a question that doesn't need one. Just as a doctor wouldn't attempt to answer a question about the theory of disease while a patient's wound is still bleeding, the Buddha refrained from answering theoretical questions about self because such inquiries do not directly address the problem of human suffering. The Buddha's silence on the self. The Buddha's refusal to directly answer whether a self exists or not speaks volumes. His silence was not ignorance, but a profound understanding that the concept of self is rooted in attachment and clinging. Whether you define the self as interconnected or separate, any identification with a self leads to suffering. This attachment to self, whether you are attached to the idea of a self that is unique, eternal, or interconnected, is the very root of suffering. The Buddha recognized that engaging in these debates only perpetuates the cycle of craving and aversion, which is at the heart of human suffering. By avoiding these questions, the Buddha invited us to look at life from a different perspective. One where the concept of self is irrelevant. It is only by letting go of self-identification, whether that self is small and separate, or large and all-encompassing, that true freedom from suffering can be attained. The 4 Noble Truths. Rather than getting lost in abstract philosophical debates about the nature of the self, the Buddha offered a practical guide for liberation. The 4 Noble Truths. These truths focus on understanding the nature of suffering, its causes, its cessation, and the path that leads to its cessation. They do not provide theoretical answers about the self. Instead, they offer a clear, experiential framework for understanding and overcoming suffering. The Buddha emphasized that the essence of the 4 Noble Truths lies in personal experience. They are categories of experience, not abstract doctrines about the self or the other. The first truth teaches us to understand that suffering exists. The second points to attachment as the cause of suffering. The third shows us that suffering can cease. And the fourth lays out the path to end suffering. By focusing on these truths, we begin to see that the answer to suffering lies not in abstract concepts, but in how we live our lives, and how we relate to our experiences. The application of anatta in practice. The practice of anatta, no self, is not about denying the self or erasing the individual. It's about letting go of attachment to the self. This means understanding that when we cling to anything, whether it's a role, an identity, or an idea, we are creating suffering for ourselves. As we cultivate virtue, concentration, and discernment, we come to realize that holding on to things, thinking they are me, myself, or mine, only leads to suffering. True freedom arises when we stop clinging to the illusion of self. We don't need to focus on whether we are or aren't a self. Instead, we should focus on the present moment, our experiences, and whether holding on to those experiences causes suffering. This shift in focus is the essence of Buddhist practice. As we continue on the path, we gradually let go of the attachment to the self and experience increasing peace and freedom from suffering. The more we practice, the more we recognize that all things, our thoughts, feelings, and experiences, are impermanent and not truly ours to possess. The problem with self-identification. The root of suffering lies in our attachment to the concept of self. Whether we identify with a role, a status, or even a belief, this attachment keeps us bound to suffering. The Buddha's teaching on anatta helps us break free from this trap. By showing that identifying with anything, whether it is a particular thought, feeling, or social identity, leads to unnecessary pain. For instance, when we identify ourselves as a successful person, based on our job title, we risk experiencing pain when that success is threatened. Likewise, when we see ourselves as good or bad, based on our actions, we create a sense of self that is constantly under pressure to maintain its image. This is the clinging that causes suffering. Living the practice of anatta. In practice, anatta leads us to ask different questions. Not, what is myself, but, does clinging to this idea, role, or identity cause suffering? The practice of letting go of attachment requires cultivating virtues such as mindfulness, concentration, and discernment. As we develop these qualities, we start to question the validity of the labels and identities we cling to. Through letting go of these attachments, we experience more freedom. This process is gradual, but each step brings us closer to the peace that comes from seeing things as they truly are, without the lens of self-identification distorting our view. Conclusion. The Buddha's teaching of anatta is not about denying the self's existence, but about seeing the attachments that cause suffering. As we release the need to cling to fixed ideas of who we are, we move closer to true freedom. When we let go of the concept of self, we uncover a limitless peace and freedom, where the questions of self, or no self, no longer matter. What remains is the experience of liberation from suffering and the realization of undying happiness. Lesson to take away. In our daily lives, we often cling to roles, titles, and labels that bring us stress and pain. But when we practice anatta, we begin to let go of these attachments. Freedom does not come from defining ourselves, but from releasing the need to be defined at all. By embracing this wisdom, we can find lasting peace and open ourselves to a deeper connection with life.